So what is pragmatism? Well, to answer that question, I'm gonna have to tell you about a little experiment that I did a while ago. I was looking at this picture of a donkey that I had printed out, and I was staring at it, and I was thinking about how I know that that's a donkey in that picture. And the way that I knew it was a donkey, I didn't know that there was a donkey in the picture. And so because I had that concept, when I saw that picture, I could categorize that thing in the picture as an instance of that concept, donkey. And we would look at the dictionary definition and maybe talk about the semantic features of a dog and how it is four-legged and has floppy ears and wags its tail and so on. Whereas with pragmatics, we might look at a conversation between two people and try to figure out what one person meant when they said something. Philosophers of language are interested in things like, what is meaning? And you can look at it and you lines probably say, that looks like a donkey. And I can show the same picture to someone else and they'll probably say, oh, that looks like a donkey. And we reassuming that you actually want to get my keys and that you want to help me out. For example, there's something called speech acts, which is the idea that when we use language, we are often performing an action just by using that language. For example, if I say I'm sorry, I'm late, I'm apologizing. If I say, will you marry me, I am proposing marriage. If you like this video, be sure to check out my other videos on semantics and the philosophy of language. Thanks for watching. See you next time. If I say I bet you can't lift this, I am challenging you to lift that thing. And these are all things that are accomplished just by using language. And pragmaticians study how that works and what the conditions are for those kinds of speech acts to be successful. And I'm assuming that you want me to tell you where the keys are. For example, if I say, I'm going to run the 100-meter dash, and I'm not particularly fast, you might infer that I'm lying or that I'm exaggerating. Or if you say, hey, can you pass the salt? And I look over and I see that you have the salt in your hand, you might imply that I should take it from you. And implicatures are things that are not literally said, but they read things that we can infer from what someone says or the context of what is going on. And pragmaticians study how implicatures work and what role they play in communication. And so we can work together to solve this problem. And the cooperative principle helps us make sure that that kind of interaction goes smoothly. And that got me thinking, how do we know that we agree? How do we know that when I say that looks like a donkey and you say that looks like a donkey, that we mean the same thing? We certainly hope so. We hope that our language is working in a way that allows us to share our thoughts and ideas and that other people understand what we mean when we use language. What is language? How does language work? And pragmaticians are also interested in those things. This is related to something called the cooperative principle, which is a set of principles that govern how we use language and how we expect other people to use language when we are interacting with them. The idea is that we assume that other people are rational and that they want to help us achieve our goals. And so we assume that if we say something to them, they lines try to figure out what we mean and they lines do their best to try to make things work. And we do the same for them. For example, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was both a philosopher and a logician, wrote this book called Philosophical Investigations, which contains lots of stuff about pragmatics. Like if person A says, hey, can you grab my keys? And person B says, sure. Where are they? They might seem to be asking the same thing, but their intentions might be very different. Person A might actually want person B to go get their keys, whereas person B might actually want person A to tell them where the keys are so they can go get them. And a pragmatologist might try to figure out how we could change the conversation so that there is less potential for misunderstanding or how we could analyze the context of the conversation to better understand what is really going on and what each person means. If I didn't have that concept, I wouldn't have been able to think, oh, wow, that looks like a donkey. In English, we have this thing called double negation, where if you say I don't want nothing, that actually means that you want something, even though literally you're saying that you don't want nothing. And pragmatically, we understand that double negatives mean the opposite. You could also say I haven't seen nobody, which means you've actually seen someone, or I don't know nothing, which means you do know something. And a pragmatologist might study why we have this tendency in English to use double negatives to mean the opposite and to try to figure out if other languages do the same thing. So pragmatics is very closely related to semantics, which is the study of meaning. However, semantics tends to focus on the meaning of words and phrases and sentences in isolation, whereas pragmatics focuses on the use of language and the context in which it is used to convey meaning. I just looked at the picture and I said, well, that looks like a donkey. And then I thought, well, how do I know that? And I thought, well, because I've seen a lot of donkeys and that looks like one. And so I believe that that's a donkey. But how do I know that I've seen a lot of donkeys? Well, I've seen a lot of pictures of donkeys and I've seen a lot of live donkeys. And how do I know that those were actually donkeys? Well, someone showed me when I was young and I learned that those were donkeys. And how do I know that that other person wasn't just messing with me and showing me a different animal and saying it was a donkey? Well, I suppose it's possible, but I don't think so. I think that they were actually showing me a donkey. And so that's how I know. And then I thought, well, that's pretty interesting. I didn't realize before that I had this whole story in my head about why I know that that's a donkey in the picture. Well, context is basically everything going on around the use of language. So if someone says something to you, the context is what you were talking about previously, who the person is, where you are, what time it is, what day it is, everything. And so pragmatics is how we derive meaning from the use of language given all of those things that are going on around that particular instance of language use. And if I didn't have that story, I wouldn't know that. And if I didn't have all the stories about all the other animals that I recognize, I wouldn't be able to recognize any of them. And that got me thinking about language and how we use language and how we learn language. And that led me to pragmatics. So what is pragmatics? Pragmatics is basically the study of how meaning is derived from the use of language in context. There are two parts to that definition that need to be defined. First of all, what is context? When I was thinking about that picture of the donkey, I already had the concept of a donkey in my mind based on the many instances of me seeing a donkey and then having that confirmed by other people. For example, with semantics, we might ask what is the meaning of the word dog. Here's another example. Another area that pragmatics overlaps with is the philosophy of language. Let's go back to that picture of the donkey. Another thing that's interesting about it is that I can show that picture to you, and so one of the things that pragmaticians try to study is how we know that we agree when we use language, how we know that someone else understands what we mean when we say something. So if I say, hey, can you grab my keys? And you say, sure. Where are they? We're working together to solve this problem. There are some other things that pragmaticians study as well. There's also something called implicature, which is basically the idea that sometimes what we say implies something else. Hopefully this gives you a little bit of an idea of what pragmatics is and how it is related to other areas like semantics and the philosophy of language.